the day everything changed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone when I read the email from the Social Security Administration. The words seemed to blur together on the screen, but one phrase kept jumping out at me: fraudulent claims totaling $320,000. I had to read it 3 times before my brain could actually process what was happening. In that moment, sitting on the edge of my bed, in that damp basement room I rented from my own parents, I realised that everything I thought I knew about my family had been a lie. And I was about to find out just how deep that deception went. If what I'm about to tell you shocks you as much as it shocked me, please like this video and subscribe for more stories like this. Drop a comment telling me if you would have done what I did. Because trust me, the decision I made next changed everything. Let me take you back to where this nightmare really began. My name is Sarah, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to be invisible. Not the kind of invisible where nobody notices you because you're quiet or shy. I'm talking about the kind of invisible where you learn to make yourself small because it's easier than taking up space in a room where you're not wanted. My father, Robert, was a successful real estate developer with money and connections. My mother, Eleanor, came from old money, the kind of wealth that meant she spent her days on committees and charity boards, coordinating galas and fundraisers where she could show off her jewellery and her vacation homes. Then there was my sister Jessica, who was 3 years younger and apparently born with every advantage I was somehow denied. She had the blonde hair that my mother always wanted, the kind of effortless beauty that made people turn their heads when she walked into a room. She had natural athleticism, social grace, and an absolute conviction that the world owed her everything it had to offer. The household I grew up in was not a warm place. It was a place of performance. Every meal felt like a stage production. Every conversation had an agenda. My parents spoke to each other with the kind of formal courtesy that you might use with business associates, not with someone you shared a bed with. They kept separate schedules, separate friends, and what I would later understand were separate romantic interests. The first time I really understood that something was fundamentally wrong with how my family treated me, I was 17 years old. I had worked an entire summer at a McDonald's located in a rough part of Seattle, working the early morning shift before school and evening shifts on weekends. I saved every single dollar, refusing even to buy myself a soda or a snack during my breaks. By the end of the summer, I had exactly $2,000 in a bank account that I had opened without telling my parents. That money was for a school trip to Washington, D.C., something that I had been dreaming about since freshman year. The trip was organised by our history department, and everyone was going to sleep in a youth hostel and visit the Smithsonian museums, the Lincoln Memorial, the White House, all the places that I had only ever read about in books. When I told my parents about the trip during dinner one evening, my mother barely looked up from her laptop where she was checking email. My father set down his fork with a sharp clink against his plate and delivered his verdict like a judge handing down a sentence. He said the trip was beneath us, that our family did not associate with youth hostels and public transportation. He said if I wanted to travel, he would send me to Europe next summer, and we could stay at 5-star hotels like civilized people. But there was a catch. There was always a catch with my parents. They wanted me to work for them instead of going on the school trip. They needed someone to manage their rental properties during the summer. They said it was valuable experience and essential training for business, and that I should be grateful for the opportunity to learn from them. My mother didn't even look at me when she added that Jessica had been invited on a shopping trip to Paris by one of her friend's parents, and of course they were going to let her go because it was such a wonderful opportunity for her to gain cultural exposure. Jessica was only 14. She had done nothing to earn that trip except be born as my parents' favourite child. I didn't go to Washington, D.C. I spent that summer working 15-hour days managing tenant complaints and showing apartments and dealing with maintenance issues. I did the work competently and without complaint, and my father thanked me by deducting the cost of my room and board from any compensation I might have received. So I worked for free. When my parents left in August for a month-long trip to Italy, staying at a villa outside Florence, they sent me to stay with my grandmother instead of taking me with them. My grandmother lived in a small house in Tacoma, and she was kind to me, but also exhausted from arthritis and financial struggles. Meanwhile, Jessica got to go to Italy. She spent 2 weeks in Milan shopping at the Galleria and taking pictures for Instagram and trying on clothes that my parents bought for her without even checking the prices. By the time I was 18 years old and preparing to leave for college, I had already internalized the fundamental truth of my family structure. I was useful to them, but I was not loved by them. I was a tool, not a daughter. Jessica was the treasure. I was the afterthought. College was supposed to be my escape. I got into a good school in California on a substantial scholarship, the kind that came with an athletic component, because I had been on the rowing team throughout high school. I was so excited, so hopeful, so convinced that my life was finally going to change. 2 weeks before I was supposed to move into the dorm, my mother had a conversation with me in the kitchen. She told me very calmly and very rationally that my father's business had taken a turn for the worse. They were having cash flow problems. They had made some bad investments. They needed me to defer my college admission for a year and live at home and help them manage their portfolio. She made it sound like a temporary sacrifice, like something I would do out of family loyalty and then move on from. She made it sound like the right thing to do. I deferred my admission for 1 year. That 1 year turned into 2 years, which turned into 3 years, which turned into 5 years. By the time I finally understood that I was never actually going to go to college, I was 23 years old, and my parents had moved on to using my labour in different ways. My father told me that college was overrated anyway, that most people who went to college ended up in debt and unemployed. He said I was lucky to be living at home instead of wasting money on tuition. My mother stopped asking me about my dreams. Gradually, everyone stopped asking me about my dreams. When I was 22 years old, I developed severe chronic back pain that came seemingly out of nowhere. It started as occasional twinges, the kind of thing that you notice but don't worry about. Within months, it had escalated to a level of pain that was almost unbearable. Some mornings I would wake up and literally could not move. I would lie in bed for hours waiting for the pain medication I had to buy myself to kick in enough that I could function. I went to multiple doctors trying to figure out what was wrong. They did X-rays and MRIs and found evidence of deteriorated discs and nerve compression. One doctor suggested that the pain was partly psychological, the result of years of stress and anxiety and poor posture while working on my parents' properties. I knew he was probably right. My body had absorbed all the stress and rejection and disappointment of my life, and now it was literally breaking down under the weight of it. By 23, the pain had become so severe that I couldn't work anymore. I had been working various jobs since I was 16, but now, even standing up for 8 hours was causing me to almost pass out from the intensity of the pain. I realised that I needed to find work that would allow me to sit down, or at least not be on my feet constantly. After searching for months, I found a job as a waitress at a local diner in Seattle called the Copper Pot. It wasn't glamorous. The diner served basic breakfast food and sandwiches, and the clientele was a mix of construction workers heading to job sites and elderly people who came in for the early bird specials. But the job allowed me to move between tables and the kitchen, and the manager was sympathetic enough to let me take short breaks when my back was particularly bad. I took this job at 23, and I worked there for the next 3 years. Those 3 years at the Copper Pot were the most physically and emotionally difficult years of my life. I was in constant pain that never truly went away, even with medication. I was living in a room in my parents' basement, a damp space that flooded slightly every winter, and that my mother had decorated with second-hand furniture that nobody else in the house wanted. I was paying rent to live in that basement, $500 a month, which was half of what I was earning before taxes. I was also paying for my own medical bills, my own medications, my own food. I was living on less than $1,000 a month, and I was miserable. But I was also learning to be resilient. I was learning that I could survive things that I thought would break me. The pain got worse progressively over time. My doctor warned me that I was at risk of permanent nerve damage if I didn't get surgery soon. He said the condition was degenerative and that without intervention I could face partial or total paralysis in the affected areas. He sent me to a specialist, a surgeon named Dr. Michael Caldwell, who had an office overlooking Elliott Bay. Dr. Caldwell examined me carefully and explained that I needed a spinal fusion procedure. He said it was not an emergency surgery in the immediate sense, but it was urgent in the sense that if I waited much longer, the nerve damage could become irreversible. The cost of the surgery, including the hospital fees and the anaesthesia and the post-operative care, would be approximately $15,000. $15,000. It was a number that seemed impossible, like I was being asked to produce $15 million. I was making maybe $900 a week at the diner before taxes. After taxes, I was taking home about $600 a week. Rent took $500 of that. The rest had to cover food, medications, transportation, utilities. There was no mathematical way that I could possibly save $15,000. I would die working at that diner before I could save enough money for the surgery. So I did the only thing I could think of to do. I went to my parents. I remember that day very clearly. I had printed out the letter from Dr. Caldwell and the surgical estimate, and I had practiced what I was going to say to my parents. I was going to be calm and reasonable and factual. I was going to present it as a problem that needed solving, not as an emotional plea or a request for help. My mother was in her dressing room trying on evening gowns. She was preparing for the Emerald City Ball, an annual charity gala that was one of the social events of the season. She was surrounded by mirrors and fabrics and the discarded attempts of other dresses scattered across a velvet bench. The dress she was currently wearing was a floor-length number in emerald green silk, something that probably cost more than 3 months of my salary. I walked in and I tried to keep my voice steady. I explained that I needed to have spinal surgery. I explained that Dr. Caldwell believed it was urgent. I showed her the letter and the estimate. I told her that I had been saving what I could, but I couldn't possibly save enough in time. My mother held the letter at arm's length, like it might somehow transmit a disease if she got too close to it. She glanced at the numbers, and I watched her face arrange itself into an expression of concern that I somehow knew was not genuine. She turned back to the mirror and adjusted the neckline of the emerald dress. "Sarah, you know that our financial situation is not what it used to be," she said, speaking to my reflection in the mirror rather than to me directly. "We've had some significant losses in the market. Your father's business is not as stable as it once was. $15,000 is simply not something that we can afford right now. Have you thought about trying alternative therapies? I've been reading a lot about yoga lately. I've heard it can be quite effective for back pain. Perhaps you could look into a few classes at the studio in Madison Park." That night my father came to my room in the basement. This was unusual because my father rarely came down to the basement. He rarely came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed in a way that made me immediately tense because I knew that something serious was coming. He told me that he had been thinking about my situation. He said he understood that I was in pain and that he sympathized with that. But he also wanted me to understand the broader picture. He said that he had just committed a significant amount of capital to an investment in Jessica's future. Jessica had come to him with an idea for a fashion and lifestyle blog, something that she wanted to launch in partnership with a friend. She had a compelling business plan and real potential, and my father believed that this investment could turn into something significant. He said he had allocated $100,000 to get Jessica's startup off the ground. He said he believed in his children's potential, but he also believed in self-sufficiency. He said that I was old enough to solve my own problems now. He said, and I remember these words exactly, "You're an adult now, Sarah. You need to learn to take care of yourself. The world doesn't owe you anything." After he left, I cried for about 3 hours straight. Not delicate crying, the kind of crying where you can't breathe properly and your whole body convulses. Jessica found me in my room that evening. She came down to the basement looking for something she had stored there, some winter clothes or something, I don't really remember. She saw me lying on my bed with heating pads arranged around my back and ice packs on my shoulders. She made a face like she had smelled something bad. "Why are you always such a drama queen?" she asked me. Her tone was light and casual, like she wasn't asking one of the cruelest questions anyone could ask a person who was suffering. "Like everyone has problems, Sarah. You don't have to make it everyone's business all the time. I tried to explain to her that I wasn't trying to make it anyone's business, that I was just struggling with something difficult. I told her that I needed surgery and that I didn't know how I was going to pay for it. I thought that maybe she would have some compassion for me, or maybe even some solidarity as her sister. Maybe she would mention my conversation to our parents and advocate for me. Instead, she laughed. She actually laughed. She said that everyone had pain sometimes, that pain wasn't unique to me, that I was just looking for an excuse to get attention from our parents. She said that she had her own stresses, like trying to build a business and deal with haters on social media. She said that I was always so negative and victim-minded, and that it was exhausting to be around someone who was always complaining. Then, and I remember this moment with perfect clarity, because it was the moment something inside me started to change. She kicked at my leg, where the heating pad was pressed against my back. It wasn't a hard kick, but it was deliberate, and it was meant to hurt, and it did hurt. She said, "Stop making babo-mouthed about pain and go figure your shit out. You're making mum and dad stress, and frankly, you're stressing me out too. Just get a different job or something." Then she left, and I heard her go back upstairs, and I heard her laughing on the phone with someone about something, and I realised that my sister did not see me as a person. I was not a person to her. I was an obstacle, an irritation, a member of her family that she would never have chosen to be related to. The years that followed were a haze of survival instinct and sheer determination not to collapse. I worked at the copper pot through my pain. I took the cheapest pain medication I could find, usually generic ibuprofen or acetaminophen from gas station shelves. I used dollar store heating pads that only lasted a few months before the heating elements broke. I wore compression wraps that I bought online from sketchy retailers. I did physical therapy exercises that I looked up on YouTube performed by physical therapists who were probably not qualified to be dispensing medical advice on the internet. But I also watched. I watched my parents spend money like it was infinite. I watched them renovate the kitchen in the main house, spending more on that renovation than I would make in my entire lifetime. I watched them take international vacations to places like Tokyo and Barcelona and Bali. I watched them join country clubs and buy memberships to private golf courses. I watched them constantly acquire new things, new clothes, new jewellery, new art for the walls of their house. And I watched Jessica. I watched Jessica very carefully. Jessica got a brand new car for her 21st birthday. It was a Mercedes AMG C63, a sleek two-seater in metallic silver with black leather interior, and it cost more than $150,000. My parents gave it to her as a present for completing her first year at the University of Washington. 1 year of college, which from what I could tell, mostly involved her attending parties and posting pictures on Instagram and going to her classes whenever she felt motivated enough. She posted 100 pictures of the car online from every angle imaginable. She took pictures sitting in the driver's seat. She took pictures with the car in sunset. She took pictures with her friends standing around it. She made the car her entire identity for about 2 weeks on Instagram. Meanwhile, I was still in pain. The pain had become something that I just lived with constantly, the way some people live with background noise. It was always there. It was sometimes unbearable, but it was always there, and I still could not afford the surgery that might fix it. Jessica's fashion blog became a semi-successful venture in the local Seattle market. She had managed to build up a modest following of people who were interested in her recommendations for clothing and accessories and lifestyle choices. She got sponsorships from various brands who paid her to wear their products or feature them on her blog. It wasn't making her a fortune, but it was supplementing the allowance that our father was giving her. And yes, she was 21 years old, with her own car and a brand new apartment in Queen Anne, and she was still receiving an allowance from our father. An allowance that was more than my total monthly income. By the time I was 26 years old, I had become resigned to the fact that I would never have the surgery. I had become resigned to a life of managing pain, of limiting my activities, of accepting that parts of my spine were slowly degenerating, and that I would probably eventually face some form of paralysis. I had stopped hoping that things would change because hope had become too painful. It was easier to simply accept my fate and move through the world in a kind of numb determination. And then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in early March, a day that started like any other day. I had worked a double shift the previous day, and I was exhausted. I was lying in bed trying to work up the energy to get out of bed when my phone rang. The caller ID said it was the Social Security Administration. I almost didn't answer because I assumed it was a scam call of some kind, but something made me pick up. Something told me that this call was important. The woman on the other end of the phone was not polite. Her name was Patricia Reeves, and she was a fraud investigator for the Social Security Administration's Office of Inspector General. She told me that she was calling because my account had been flagged as part of a routine investigation into suspicious activity in the Disability Benefits Program. She said that according to their records, I had been receiving Social Security disability insurance benefits for the past 10 years. 10 years. She said that the benefits were approximately $1,500 per month, which added up to a total of $180,000 over the 10-year period. I told her that was impossible. I told her that I had never received a single dollar from the Social Security Administration. I told her that I had no idea why she was calling me. I told her that if someone had been collecting benefits in my name, they had not been giving the money to me. Her tone shifted immediately from stern to very serious. She asked me to wait on the line. I could hear her typing on a keyboard. She came back and told me that she had just reviewed my account, and something had definitely been very wrong. She said that the benefits had been deposited every month into a bank account that was registered in my name, but that had not been accessed by me. She said that the account was set up with a routing and account number that was different from any account that I currently had. She said that there was a third party that was authorised to withdraw from that account. She wanted to know if I had given anyone permission to access a bank account in my name. She wanted to know if I knew who that person was. She wanted to know if I had been evading the Social Security Administration's attempts to contact me about these benefits. She wanted to know if I was trying to commit fraud. My hands went numb. My voice wouldn't work. I kept asking her to repeat herself because nothing was making sense. I told her I knew nothing about the account, nothing about who set it up, nothing about where the money was going. I promised to cooperate with the investigation. She told me to expect someone from her office to contact me within 48 hours. She told me not to attempt to access the account or communicate with anyone about this investigation. She told me to gather any financial records that I had and to be prepared to answer detailed questions about my finances and my employment history. After I hung up the phone, I sat on my bed for a very long time, and I tried to process what she had just told me. Someone had set up an account in my name. Someone had been collecting disability benefits in my name for 10 years. Someone had been withdrawing that money every single month for the past 10 years. And I had no idea who that person was. But actually, as I sat there thinking about it, I realised that I might have a very good idea who that person was. My grandfather called me 3 days later. My grandfather is William Chen, my father's father, and he is one of the very few people in my family who has ever treated me with genuine kindness and respect. My grandfather immigrated to the United States from Taiwan in the 1970s with nothing but a suitcase and a degree in engineering. He built his own technology company during the early days of the semiconductor industry, and he became very wealthy through that business. But he never let the money change who he was fundamentally. He was always kind to me. He always asked about my life and my dreams. He always made me feel like I was a real person, not just a background character in my family's drama. He came to the house unannounced on a Saturday morning. He told my mother that he wanted to spend some time with me, and my mother couldn't really refuse without being obviously rude to her father-in-law. He took me out for breakfast at a small diner in Georgetown, not the one where I worked, but a different one with red vinyl booths and strong coffee and pancakes that melted in your mouth. We were halfway through breakfast when he looked at me directly and asked me how I was really doing. Not how I was doing in the superficial sense of the question, but really doing. He asked me if there was anything going on that he should know about. I think he already knew something was wrong. I think someone had called him about the Social Security investigation. But I answered him truthfully. I told him about the pain, about the surgery, about my parents refusing to help me, about the mysterious phone call from the Social Security Administration. I watched his face as I was telling him this story. I watched the anger build in his eyes, watched his jaw clench. I had rarely seen my grandfather angry before. He was such a calm person normally, but I could see the fury building inside him, the kind of deep anger that comes from someone discovering that someone they trusted has done something betraying. When I finished my story, he was quiet for a long time. He just looked at me across the table in a way that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely alone in this world. He pulled out his phone and he made a call. He said, "This is William Chen. I need to speak with Robert Stone, my attorney. Yes, I'll hold." Then he waited, and then he said, "Robert, I need you to do something for me immediately. I need you to open a full investigation into my son's financial records. I need you to look at every bank account, every transaction, every asset that my son has. I need to know where the money is going. I need to know if there are accounts in the name of other family members. I need this done within 48 hours. Then he hung up. He looked at me and he said, "Let me handle this, Sarah. Don't worry anymore. I'm going to find out what happened to your money." 2 days later, my grandfather called me back. He told me that his lawyer had hired a forensic accountant and that they had already discovered something very important. The account that the Social Security benefits were being deposited into was a joint account. It was set up in my name, but it was also set up so that my father could access it and withdraw from it freely. My father had been the one collecting my disability benefits every single month. And then he had been withdrawing that money and using it to fund his and my mother's lifestyle and Jessica's lifestyle. When my grandfather's accountant dug deeper into the transactions, they found a pattern that was absolutely damning. My father had been using my disability benefits money to purchase a wide variety of items. Some of it had gone toward vacations. My parents had taken a trip to Hawaii in 2019 that cost $25,000. That money came from my account. My father had also used the money to purchase a Rolex watch for himself, a timepiece that cost $15,000. He had used the money to purchase a Louis Vuitton bag for my mother, $7,000. He had purchased the down payment on Jessica's Mercedes, an amount that totaled $40,000. He had paid for Jessica's apartment in Queen Anne a year's rent that was $24,000. He had funded sponsorships and trips for Jessica's lifestyle blog. He had funded everything that Jessica wanted. The total amount of money that my father had stolen from my disability account over the 10-year period came to $320,000. $320,000. Money that had been set aside by the federal government to help me, a disabled person, live with dignity and have access to the medical care and support systems that I needed. Money that my father had taken and used to buy himself watches and fund his daughter's lifestyle. $320,000 of my life taken from me by my own father. The man who had refused to pay for my surgery because the family financial situation was difficult. My grandfather did not tell my father that he knew about this immediately. Instead, he spent the next few weeks working with his lawyers and with federal prosecutors. My grandfather had connections, you see. He had been successful in business for a long time, and he knew people in positions of power. He worked with the FBI, he worked with the IRS, he worked with the State Attorney General's office. By the time my grandfather was done laying the groundwork, there was a federal case building against my father for wire fraud, disability, fraud, misappropriation of government benefits, and tax evasion. The case was airtight. My grandfather's forensic accountant had documented every single transaction. There was no way my father could defend himself against these charges. And then my grandfather decided it was time for my entire family to find out what had happened. Thanksgiving was approaching, and my parents had decided to host the entire extended family for a massive dinner celebration. They wanted to show off their house and their apparent wealth and their successful lives. They invited my father's siblings, my mother's parents, all of my cousins, aunts, uncles, the entire clan. My mother had been planning this dinner for weeks. She had hired caterers and florists and people to come clean the house. She had new china delivered from an expensive import company. She had the house decorated like something out of a magazine spread in a home design publication. Every surface gleamed. Every flower arrangement was perfectly positioned. Every detail was calculated to project an image of wealth and success and a family that had everything figured out. My mother also assigned me a specific role for the evening. I was to stay in the kitchen and help the catering staff prepare and serve the food. I was essentially to be a servant in my own family's home. Jessica, of course, was to be seated at the main table with the important family members, where she could showcase herself and tell everyone about her successful lifestyle blog and her impressive car and her amazing life. I showed up that evening wearing a simple black dress that I had owned for years. My mother took one look at me and told me to go change into something more appropriate for the help. I changed into a white shirt and black pants, essentially a waitress uniform, and I resigned myself to spending the evening in the kitchen while my family celebrated above my head. The dinner was scheduled to begin at 6 o'clock in the evening. By 5:45, my grandfather had arrived with his attorney, Robert Stone. My mother assumed they were just other guests arriving early, which gave my grandfather exactly the element of surprise he wanted. He and Robert Stone came into the dining room where my father was already seated at the head of the table. My father was wearing an expensive suit and he had a confident expression on his face because he had no idea that his entire life was about to explode. My grandfather sat down at the table without being invited. He didn't make any small talk. He simply looked at my father and said, "We need to talk about the money, Robert." My father's face went pale. He tried to play it off like he didn't know what my grandfather was talking about, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He said something stupid like, "I don't know what you mean, Father." And my grandfather said, "I'm sure you do. I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. But let me explain it to the rest of the family so everyone understands what kind of man you truly are." This is when my grandfather signalled to Robert Stone to set up the presentation. Stone had brought a small projector with him and his assistant had already set it up in the corner of the dining room where it was pointed at one of the walls. Stone dimmed the lights and suddenly the wall lit up with bank statements, transaction histories, account summaries, all the evidence of my father's 10-year scheme to steal from his disabled daughter. The first slide showed the money coming in, regular deposits of $1,500 every single month for 10 years. The next slide showed the money going out, purchases of luxury items, vacations, restaurant bills for thousands of dollars at a time, cash withdrawals in large amounts, transfers to accounts that belonged to my mother and Jessica. Every single transaction was documented and displayed, and my relatives were seeing in real time exactly what my father had done. There was chaos. There was immediate chaos. My mother started screaming that these documents were fraudulent, that my grandfather was trying to destroy my father out of spite, that this was clearly some kind of attack on the family. But her voice was shaking, and everyone could tell that on some level she knew the documents were real. She knew what my father had done because she had probably benefited from it. She had probably worn those luxury items. She had probably enjoyed those expensive vacations. My relatives started asking questions. They wanted to know what this was about. They wanted to know if this was real. They wanted to know why the money was in my account and where it had come from. My grandfather explained the situation calmly and clearly. He explained that I had been receiving disability benefits money that was meant to help me with my medical needs and my daily living expenses. He explained that my son, my father, had intercepted those benefits and used them for personal enrichment. He explained that the amount of money involved was $320,000. I was still in the kitchen at this point, but I could hear everything. The catering staff had stopped working. Everyone was just standing there listening to this conversation play out in the dining room. One of the catering assistants, a young woman named Maria, reached over and squeezed my hand. She didn't say anything, but that gesture meant more to me than almost any words could have meant. That was when I decided I couldn't stay in the kitchen anymore. I walked out into the dining room in my white shirt and black pants, and suddenly all the attention turned to me. Everyone at the table turned to look at me. My father looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between rage and fear. My mother looked at me with an expression that was pure contempt. Jessica looked at me with an expression of shock that was almost comical in its intensity. I walked directly to my father and I said, "You told me there was no money for my surgery. You said the family financial situation was too difficult. You said I needed to be independent. But you had my money. You had 10 years of my money. You spent it on vacations and watches and cars and luxury items for Jessica. And I've been living in pain in your basement, paying you rent to live in a room that floods every winter, watching you give her everything while you give me nothing." My voice was not loud, but everyone in the dining room could hear me. The room was absolutely silent. My mother opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Jessica stood up from the table. I could see in her eyes that she was panicking. She was realizing that all of this, all of her advantages, all of the money that had been spent on her, had come from a source that was now being exposed as fraudulent and criminal. She was realizing that people were going to blame her for this, that she had benefited from stolen money, that she was complicit in my father's crimes, whether she knew it or not. And then in what I think was a moment of pure panic and rage, Jessica did something that I will never forget. She lunged at me. She didn't say anything, she just lunged. And she slapped me across the face so hard that the sound of it echoed through the entire dining room. She called me a name. She called me a worthless burden. And she told me that I had always been a burden on this family, that I was jealous of her success, that I was trying to destroy her happiness out of spite. She told me that I was pathetic and that nobody would ever love me and that I deserved to be in pain. I don't really know what happened next. I remember there being a hot tureen of turkey gravy on the serving table. I remember picking it up. I remember that my hands were no longer shaking. I remember feeling completely calm, like I had stepped outside of my body and was watching this scene unfold from somewhere above the table. I remember thinking very clearly about the consequences of what I was about to do, and I remember deciding that I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I threw the entire tureen at Jessica. Not just splashed it. I threw it with all of the strength that my back pain had not yet stolen from me. The hot gravy hit her directly in the face and all down the front of her white designer dress. It was the kind of dress that probably cost more than $1,000. It was the kind of dress that was meant to make her look beautiful and sophisticated and like she had her entire life figured out. She screamed. Oh my God, she screamed. It was the most primal, most genuine sound I had ever heard come out of her mouth. She was screaming because the gravy was hot and it was burning her skin and it was staining her dress, and she was humiliated in front of the entire extended family. She was screaming because in one single moment, everything that had been easy about her life had suddenly become very complicated. My father stood up from the table. His face was completely red and the veins in his neck were standing out. He came around the table toward me with his fist raised. He was going to hit me. I could see it in his eyes. He had never hit me before, but in that moment, with his entire criminal scheme exposed, and his favourite daughter screaming, and his carefully constructed image of success crumbling around him, he was going to hit me. He never got the chance. 2 security officers, who had been standing outside the dining room door the entire time, came in and grabbed him. They were my grandfather's security people, and they had been there specifically to prevent my father from reacting physically to what was about to happen. One officer took my father's right arm and twisted it behind his back. The other officer took his left arm. My father screamed and struggled, but he was no match for 2 professional security personnel who were trained to handle exactly this kind of situation. Robert Stone, my grandfather's attorney, stood up from the table. He was a woman in her 60s, sharp-featured and dressed in an expensive tailored suit, and she looked absolutely unfazed by the chaos that was erupting around her. She simply pulled out her phone and pressed a button, and suddenly the wall that had been showing my father's bank statements lit up again with new information. "I've just contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Stone said, and her voice cut through all the screaming and chaos like a knife. "The evidence you have been looking at tonight has been transmitted to both the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service. Your financial records have been under investigation for 96 days. Every transaction that I have shown you tonight has been documented and verified. Every fraudulent claim has been substantiated. The prosecutors are prepared to move forward with charges of wire fraud, Social Security fraud, tax evasion, and misappropriation of federal disability benefits. These are federal crimes. There is no statute of limitations on federal crimes. My mother had stopped screaming. She was just staring at Stone with an expression of absolute horror on her face. My relatives were standing up from the table, some of them trying to leave, others just standing in stunned silence. Robert Stone continued speaking in that calm, measured way, like she was simply reading a grocery list. She said, "Eleanor and Robert, I need to inform you that your residence is currently under a mortgage that was held by Pacific Northwest Financial Bank. This morning at 9 o'clock, Mr. William Chen purchased that mortgage. He now owns your debt. You have 24 hours to vacate this property. Any belongings that you leave behind will be considered abandoned property and may be disposed of at Mr. Chen's discretion." She paused for effect. Additionally, she said that Mercedes AMG that is currently parked in the driveway has been purchased with fraudulently obtained government funds. That vehicle constitutes evidence in a federal investigation. The Seattle Police Department is currently on their way to this residence to collect that vehicle as evidence. Jessica, you will no longer have access to that car. As if on cue, I could hear sirens in the distance. They were getting closer. Jessica was still standing there with the gravy all over her face and her dress, and she looked like she was going to faint. She looked like she couldn't understand how this was happening to her. She had lived her entire life in a bubble of privilege and entitlement, and suddenly the walls of that bubble had collapsed, and she was facing a reality that she had never had to deal with before. My father was being held by the 2 security officers. He was still struggling, still trying to get free, still screaming that this was all a mistake, that my grandfather was lying, that there had to be some explanation. But there wasn't an explanation. The only explanation was that he had committed crimes and he had been caught. My mother had sat back down in her chair. She was staring at nothing. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her before. She looked like she was aging in real time, like the events of the last 5 minutes had added 20 years to her face. The sirens got louder. I could see red and blue lights starting to come through the windows of the house. Within moments, police officers were walking into the dining room. They had a warrant. They read my parents their rights. They put handcuffs on my father, actual metal handcuffs, and they started to lead him out of the house. My mother was also arrested, although it took her several minutes to actually stand up and walk to the police officers. She moved like she was in a dream, like she couldn't quite understand what was happening. Jessica tried to run after the police cars as they were taking my parents away. She was still in her ruined dress, still covered in gravy, and she ran out into the driveway, screaming for them to wait, screaming that she didn't understand what was happening, screaming that they couldn't just leave her alone. She wasn't watching where she was going, and she stepped off the edge of the driveway directly into a drainage ditch filled with mud and decomposing leaves from the fall season. She fell face first into the mud. She screamed again, but this time it was a different kind of scream. It was the scream of someone whose life had just become completely unmanageable, whose privileges had been completely stripped away, whose perfect existence had been completely destroyed. The rest of my extended family started to leave. They didn't know what to say. They didn't want to be around for this any longer than they had to be. I could see the looks on their faces as they walked past me. They were looks of pity and contempt and confusion all mixed together. They were looks that said, "Is this really our family? Did this really just happen?" My grandfather came over to me and he put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there with me and watched the rest of my family fall apart around us. Then he said, "I'm sorry that it took so long for me to find out what was happening, Sarah. I'm sorry that you had to suffer for as long as you did. But I promise you, from this moment forward, everything is going to change. I'm going to take care of you. Everything is going to be okay." I didn't believe him. I had learned a long time ago not to trust these kinds of promises. But I wanted to believe him. I wanted so desperately to believe that something good could come out of all of this pain. The following weeks and months were a blur of legal proceedings and investigations and FBI interviews. I had to speak to federal prosecutors about my parents' crimes. I had to explain in detail what I had experienced growing up in my family. I had to provide evidence about the pain I had been in and the medical care I had been denied. It was exhausting and traumatic, and I relived every moment of suffering I had experienced over the past 26 years. But my grandfather stood by me through all of it. He paid for the best lawyers to represent my interests. He paid for me to see a therapist so that I could process the trauma of what my family had done to me. And most importantly, he paid for my surgery. 6 months after Thanksgiving, I went into the operating room at Harbourview Medical Centre. Dr. Caldwell performed the spinal fusion surgery, and it was successful. When I woke up from the anaesthesia for the first time in years, I was not in pain. There was soreness from the surgery itself, there was definitely discomfort from the healing process, but the chronic, debilitating, all-consuming pain was gone. I cried when I realised that I could move my legs without screaming. I cried when I realised that I could sit up in bed without the world spinning around me. I cried because I had been given back a piece of my life that I thought I had lost forever. My grandfather visited me every single day while I was in the hospital. He brought me flowers and books and homemade soup that his long-time housekeeper had prepared. He sat with me while I did my physical therapy exercises. He told me stories about his own journey from Taiwan to America, about how he had overcome obstacles and built a life for himself, despite starting with nothing. He told me that I was going to be okay, and for the first time I believed him. The lawsuit that resulted from my parents' crimes took longer to resolve. My parents pleaded guilty to the charges against them. My father received 5 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution. My mother received 2 years in prison and also had to pay restitution. They were also both required to pay civil damages to me for the harm they had caused. When my parents' remaining assets were liquidated, the proceeds were ordered to be given to me as compensation for the fraud and the emotional trauma I had suffered. The amount of money that I received was substantial. Not enough to make up for the pain of my childhood, but enough to fundamentally change the trajectory of my life. I used some of that money to pay for my continued physical therapy and recovery. I used some of it to pay for my education. I finally went to college years later than I had originally planned, but I went. I studied engineering like my grandfather had, and I did well in my classes. I used the rest of the money to put a down payment on a small apartment in a nice neighbourhood in Seattle, close to Elliott Bay, with a view of the water. The apartment is small, maybe 700 square feet, but it is mine. It is clean and bright, and it has windows that let in natural light. It has heat that actually works. It doesn't have mould or moisture damage or unpleasant smells. It is a normal apartment in a normal building where normal people live their normal lives. And to me it feels like a palace. I furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece of furniture, not because it was expensive or impressive, but because I liked it, and because it made me happy. I hung art on the walls, pieces by local Seattle artists that I purchased at street fairs and galleries. I cooked meals in my own kitchen. I sat on my small balcony in the evening and watched the sun set over the water. I had my life back. It had taken 26 years and a federal prosecution and the complete destruction of my family, but I had my life back. But the most interesting thing happened about 18 months after my parents' arrest. I was driving through the university district on a Saturday afternoon, heading to a coffee shop where I had planned to study for a midterm exam. I passed a small cafe, the kind of place that serves basic coffee and pastries to students and local residents. And there, visible through the window, I saw Jessica. She was wearing the tan uniform of a cafe employee. She was standing behind the counter making drinks for customers. She looked tired and worn down in a way that Jessica had never looked before. Her hair, which had always been perfectly styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She had no makeup on. She was making a latte for a customer when she made a mistake and spilled some of the milk on the counter. The customer started yelling at her, telling her that she was incompetent and careless, and that she should probably find a different job because she was clearly not suited for this work. Jessica just stood there and took it. She apologised. She cleaned up the mess. She made the customer a new drink without complaining. She had become exactly what she had always treated me as. She had become invisible. I kept driving. I didn't stop at the cafe. I didn't wave or try to talk to her. I didn't point out the irony of her situation or make some kind of cutting remark that would have made me feel momentarily better about the harm she had caused me. I just kept driving, because Jessica was no longer a part of my world. She was no longer someone who could hurt me or diminish me or make me feel small. She was just someone who worked in a cafe that I would never visit again. She was just another person in the world who was trying to figure out how to survive. She was not my sister, she was not my family, she was nothing to me. My grandfather told me that Jessica had been accepted into a rehabilitation program for young adults who had benefited from crime. She was working through trauma therapy and trying to understand how her privileged upbringing had made her complicit in her father's crimes. She was living in a group home with 3 other young women in a similar situation, learning how to live without money and without the trappings of luxury that she had relied on her entire life. I don't know if she's genuinely trying to change or if she's just trying to survive. I don't know if she's ever felt real remorse for the way she treated me. I don't know if she's ever understood the harm that she caused. And honestly, I don't care anymore. Her journey is not my responsibility. Her redemption is not my burden. My only responsibility now is to myself, to my own healing, to my own happiness. I finished my college degree. I got a job as an engineer at a technology company here in Seattle. The job is meaningful and well paid, and it utilizes my brain in ways that I find deeply satisfying. I have co-workers who respect me and a supervisor who acknowledges my contributions. I have a life that I have built entirely on my own terms. I volunteer at a local organisation that helps people who have been victims of family financial abuse. I tell my story to other people who are going through similar situations. I help them understand that what happened to them was not their fault, that they did not deserve the treatment they received, that they deserve better, and that it is possible to build a life that is entirely separate from the family that harmed them. 3 years after my parents' arrest, my grandfather passed away. He had a heart attack in his sleep, quick and painless. At his funeral, there was a large turnout of people who had been touched by his generosity and his kindness over the years. I stood at the front of the church and told people what my grandfather had meant to me. I told them that he had literally saved my life. I told them that without his intervention, I would probably still be living in my parents' basement, still in pain, still trapped in a situation where I was being exploited and abused. I inherited his estate. The amount of money that he left me was more than I had ever imagined. It was not just enough to live on. It was enough to build a meaningful life, to invest in my future, to help other people who were in situations similar to what I had experienced. So I did. I started a non-profit organisation called Second Chances that helps victims of family financial abuse access legal resources and financial counselling and therapeutic support. We have helped more than 200 families navigate situations where one family member was stealing from another. We have helped people get their lives back. We have helped people rebuild after betrayal and theft and abuse. This is the life I have built from the ashes of my destroyed family. This is the life that I have claimed for myself. This is the life that I deserved all along. The question I have for you is this. Would you have made the same choice that I made? Would you have reported your own family to the federal government? Would you have chosen yourself over protecting their secrets? Would you have been brave enough to let your family completely fall apart? If that was what it took to save your own life, drop your answer in the comments below. If you think my story deserves to be heard, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of people who chose themselves.